going to hand it over to Seth. Tight program today. Enjoy the day. Anyone with gray shirts, we may not know what's going on, but we'll find somebody that does. Thanks so much.
All right. I'm supposed to move this out of the way for the videographers over there. Thanks for coming. This is pretty exciting for me. I usually only get to talk to lawyers at law conferences, so being back at a tech conference is just really exciting for me. Thank you for allowing me to come here. A little bit about myself. I'm the general counsel at Leo Cybersecurity. I need to be on this side of the podium, apparently. I'm general counsel at Leo Cybersecurity, but before that, I was an attorney at an airline doing their incident response there, and then I worked at a law firm, Norton Rose Fulbright. I think you guys have it up in Canada, doing data protection and privacy, helping people with incident response up there as well. But before that, I spent about a decade and a half at NASA in mission control, and so that's kind of how this presentation was born. It's a fun presentation. When I started doing incident response, I started seeing some of the same problems that we dealt with in mission control way back in the day, actually before I got there, but I knew about them. They taught us them. I saw that some of the solutions that NASA came up with might actually be ported over into incident response world. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. It's going to be pretty fast. Unfortunately, this is a full hour presentation, but we only have really 50 minutes, so apologies, we're not going to stop for questions. If I can get through it, then we can take some questions afterwards. But if not, find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter, come up to me after the conference. Happy to talk NASA stuff with you. I mean, I dig it. I'm a kind of a nerd. So we'll get started here. This is kind of our agenda today. We're going to talk quickly about the state of the industry, but not much. Then I'm going to talk to you about the NASA Mission Control Framework and how it works in mission control, at least for part of it. And then, what I hope is that while we're looking through that, you can kind of think, hey, that might work for our incident response program. No, that's too complex. Take what you will. And then we're going to watch a video at the end that kind of shows some of the things that we learned, and you get to watch flight controllers in mission control actually putting it to work. So I've got to move fast in order to get through to the video. Quick state of the industry. I don't think I need to spend much time on this. I think the amount of acronyms after all of your names would certainly win in a Scrabble match. But what I want to be is basically right here in the respond. This is the NIST cybersecurity framework. You guys recognize the 5-step approach. We're going to be kind of hanging around in here and a little bit in here. Public Safety Canada has kind of the same thing. We're going to be on these two bars. A lot of you will recognize this other pretty graphic, which is, we need to prepare, we need to recover, and then we need to make sure that we can take what we learn and put it into the plan again. So that's pretty much the only thing I'm going to talk about with respect to the state of the industry, other than there's a lot of entities calling for incident response plans these days. In certain industries in the United States, like the financial services industries in New York, for example, the New York Department of Financial Services mandates it. GDPR in Europe is going to mandate incident response plans. And then here's a list of some of the other entities that I just pulled that either require it or highly suggest it. I actually have a big list of all these things with some excerpts. So if you guys are interested in that, shoot me an email or find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to send that thing to you. Sometimes comes in handy when you're trying to make a case to the board of directors or upper management about why you need an incident response plan. As I said, I worked at NASA for a while, and we go see every space movie ever made. Usually they're very painful. This is one of them. I was going to, ask who knows what movie this is, but in the interest of kind of moving forward, I'll tell you that this is Passengers. It was a painful movie to watch. They were on a space transport to another planet, and here's Jennifer Lawrence is swimming in a pool when all of a sudden they lose their artificial gravity. Their artificial gravity was created by spinning, big arms and creating centripetal force. Why this is not possible is because, one, the pool should have been on the backside of where it is, not underneath, and two, the power went out, and so it's not like it would stop spinning immediately, and you can't find yourself floating around inside the pool. It would be a very slow, gradual thing. But This is kind of how it might feel if you have an insufficient incident response program. I remember when I was training at NASA, there were plenty of simulations where I was not prepared, and it was like suffocating. You're stuck there for 8 hours. You don't know really what you're doing, and that's kind of how I felt. I think it's important, though, to kind of talk about what I mean by incident response, because it's used in a number of ways. A lot of people talk about incident response within InfoSec only. You've got a sim going, and you're seeing threat vectors, and you're responding to them within InfoSec. What I'm talking about, and what I'm going to talk about during this presentation, is when it rises to the level that it pops out of InfoSec, and you got to bring in maybe your legal team or your communications team, HR, when it becomes an enterprise-wide event. And the reason I'm talking about that is because that's kind of what I do as the legal member of the incident response team. But I think that the things that we learn from NASA can also be applied within the InfoSec incident response field as well. So here's my State of the Industry statement, which is, and this is from the enterprise side, it's young but scrappy. I mean, what we've got is, incident response has been around for a little while, not too long in the cybersecurity world. The plans kind of started out as more of esoteric guidance documents. They're now starting to get more refined. We're starting to see checklists. We're starting to see directors. But we just haven't reached the level where we can respond very, very, very quickly in a number of different companies. You can see that in Equifax, for example. Some companies are obviously better than others. But that's kind of how I feel. And believe it or not, it's pretty easy to find a baby with boxing gloves. I was like, I wonder if I could find that. And, the Google showed me. In fact, apparently in the 30s, there was a famous photographer who just took pictures of babies with boxing gloves. And I remember. So let's talk about the mission control framework. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of fun. I really like it. Here's our next movie. Anybody know this one? Yeah, Gravity. Here we've got Colonel George Clooney towing mission specialist Sandra Bullock from the Hubble Space Telescope to the International Space Station. Not possible. This was a cringe-worthy movie in my book. They're in different inclinations. It's like going 15,000 miles an hour and trying to turn. You just can't do it. There's not enough prop on any vehicle we've ever launched into space, let alone a little EVA suit with with the thruster pack on it. Also, kind of like throwing a tennis ball to somebody on a merry-go-round, and they're not there when you get there. That's kind of how it is. If you aim at an orbiting body, you're not going to hit it. So it definitely couldn't happen. Anyway, that's let's see. This is a little bit about my prior life. I started at NASA back in the mid-'90s. Here I am with a full head of hair, flying around on the Vomit Comet. They call it the Vomit Comet because they do like 40 parabolas out over the Gulf, and you're 300 pounds, and then you're weightless, and then you're 300 pounds, and you're weightless, and everybody throws up, gets strapped in the back there. You can see them, poor guys. And so there I am, just finishing a checkout ride on the Space Shuttle simulator, and here I'm in mission control. That's Frank DeWin, who's the head of the European Astronaut Corps. I had a picture of Chris Hatfield and me, but I just couldn't find it for this one, but oh, sorry. So anyway, I spent about 14 years there, was certified on 2 vehicles, Space Shuttle and Space Station. It takes about 3 years to go through the rigorous certification program at NASA. So it's like getting a master's degree pretty much. The reason I bring that up is because we're gonna hear the Ascent and Entry team on this video later, and those guys, it takes 7 years to become Ascent and Entry certified. I mean, with the top gun of NASA. So the early NASA struggles, and hopefully it kind of sounds familiar in the incident response world, where NASA was born out of aircraft test vehicle programs, where they'd send a pilot up and say, okay, hey, go fly that plane around, and then come back down and tell me how it went. Now, eventually they started saying, hey, we can actually send telemetry down from the plane while we're flying, and we'll have Bob down there monitoring the telemetry. And then they said, well, maybe we need 2 people because we can do telemetry from the cockpit and telemetry from the flight surfaces. And eventually you had a lot of people, and that's kind of what happens when you get into spacecraft, is there's so many different systems, they all need to work together. how do you get these people to talk to each other during a very short amount of time? And so the mission control environment was born. Here's the Ficker 1, which is the flight control room that they fly the space station out of. This low-res photo was taken by me on my iPhone 2 way back in the day. I think it was probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. There I am taking a picture from the back of the room. And this is kind of what the MCC looked like originally. This is the Apollo and the Gemini control room. And so what they did is they said, look, we've got all these different specialists. I like to call them disciplines. And they need to kind of talk to each other, look at their own telemetry. So they put in a computer so that they can see what their telemetry is. They sat them in the same room so they can kind of see what they're doing, but then they put them on headsets, kind of like this one. We're going to talk about communication in a little while. And as I said, when I go through all of this mission control stuff, I want you to be thinking about, hey, what issues do we have in incident response, and how can that be mapped from mission control and incident response? We've got a lot of different disciplines in incident response, and they all kind of need to talk to each other in the event that there's an incident. So here we have some of the disciplines that we're going to see in the video later. Here's the flight director, that's the director. Booster talks about, obviously the engines. We got the environmental and the power officer. We got flight dynamics officer, guidance right there. So they basically just stick them in a room, put them on a headset, and they're able to kind of talk to each other. So let's make that connection between incident response and mission control. I kind of did that already. Anybody know this one? This is the Mir spacecraft. And very good, Armageddon. So here we spin up the Mir before we dock 2 space shuttles to it. I mean, it's just not possible. I mean, even if it were possible, it'd be the dumbest thing you could possibly do. Because remember, you're in orbit, and to fly around an orbiting, spinning vehicle, you're going to burn all your prop if you can do it at all. And then to do 2 at the same time, it's just a nightmare. It just would never happen. I'm sorry. So one of the things we found out is that my Mac wouldn't work here, and so we had to put me last minute on this Windows machine, and it looks like we have a little bit of an issue. And I'm going to try to do it as best I can on. I'm not really well suited for Windows. And the good news is if I get locked out, the password is password, and it's written here on the computer. So this is a cybersecurity conference, right? Okay, so here's kind of the areas that I think could be mapped from mission control and NASA's way of doing things to incident response. The concept of a flight director, and we don't have time to kind of talk through these in the 1 hour, but I just want to go through them because it's something to think about. The way they do flight director is very unique, and it's quite interesting. I think it would apply. The way they communicate between the hardware and the software is also interesting. The fact that they deal with multiple control centers, I mean, there's the Canadian Space Agency, there's the Japanese Space Agency, there's Russia, there's even the payloads out in Alabama. I think that would be very applicable to when you have a cyber incident response team that needs to talk to an emergency management team or a disaster recovery team or a business continuity team. The way they do training is pretty unique. And there's simulations, very high-res simulations, a little bit different than our tabletops. I think we can maybe learn a thing or two from them. Certifications, I think, are very important because it signifies, hey, yeah, somebody's had at least the requisite amount of training in order to sit in the chair of incident response, and we can understand each other because we're using the same vernacular, we're looking at the right procedures. When I talk about logging, I don't mean logging from a sim. I'm talking about actually typing in what you're seeing and what your thoughts are. And then time management skills, I think, might be applicable. But what we are going to talk about today, I have time for about 3 things, and that's the concept of procedures, the concept of rules or directives, as I call them, and the communication protocols that they use. And that's where the video is going to come in. You're going to get to hear mission controllers talking to each other. So let's talk about procedures for a second. I think procedures are very important. I think that they could be applicable in the incident response world. The current state of incident response plans is usually, in my view, and the ones that I looked at, again, it's been a few years since I was out in the field pulling people's incident response plans and looking at them, but you can get incident response plans online. A lot of universities release their incident response plans. There's plenty of samples out there, but they're generally 35 to 50 page documents that talk about what the generic team roles are, maybe a matrix that says, okay, this is high, medium, and low. And there will be some sort of thou shalt and thou shalt nots within there, but it's going to be kind of esoteric. It's hard to find that kind of stuff. So NASA had the same problem. They had these big plans, these mission plans, and people were kind of fumbling through. So what they did is they broke out from there the checklists. And you're starting to hear checklists in incident response world these days, but they took it a step further at NASA and said, you know what, we're going to take these checklists and we're going to make them procedures. That means that they're going to actually have step numbers, they're going to be time dependent, they're going to talk about who does what, and they're going to have references. The benefits here over here on the right, that it provides a step-by-step guide. If you have somebody, maybe your main incident response person for legal is not there, then the backup can come in and get moving. It also provides a set of reference so people can find ancillary documents. It's much easier to update. Anybody who's in the incident response InfoSec team, if they're the ones who have built the plan, they may have HR say, hey, we've made some changes, can you change this? I mean, you don't want to be doing that. You'd rather have HR actually make those changes. So NASA said, let's give certain procedures to each discipline. I call them disciplines, different team members. And that way they can update that. It makes it a little bit easier. It's a great training tool. If you want to certify somebody to be on the incident response team, you say, hey, read these procedures for us, learn them. Read the procedures for the other disciplines, kind of get an idea of what they're going to be going through. And we'll do a couple of questions, and now you're certified. Makes it very easy. So let's take a look at one. This over on the left is an actual NASA space station procedure. It's actually in the joint book between the space station and the space shuttle. Don't worry, it's public data now. It's been declassified. I had a hand in writing this one, so I thought it was a good one to use. You can see what we're doing here is we're about to dock the shuttle to the PMA, which is the docking port on the space station. And so the first thing we got to do is make sure that the station mode is in proximity operations and that it's on control moment gyros thruster assist. Make sure that the computers that are controlling the vehicle have an incrementing frame count, because we want to make sure if for any reason that we lost control, we don't want to start firing thrusters and have the vehicle with the shuttle there be ripped apart such that the astronauts get thrown out into space. That would be a bad thing. So what we do is, the next thing we do, step 4, 5, and 6, we load certain things directly into memory of the computers. The computers at the space station, by the way, are 386s. You think, oh wow, they should be like really great computers. No, 386s, and so we're basically loading stuff directly into memory. It's way better than the shuttle though, which was 8086s. Step 7, I think, is important. So here you say we're going to talk to another discipline. So there's the reference to another person, and then here's Mission Control Moscow, and that's where they say, okay, we're going to inhibit the thrusters right here. And then they're going to report to us that thing is complete. I think it's very important and you're going to see this in the video, to make sure that everybody on the team knows what state we're in. So you'll see a lot saying, hey, I've verified that this has occurred, and that's going to run throughout the entire mission control. That everybody's going to say copy, 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 and I concur. You're going to hear copy a lot in the video, but that's because if you don't know that this has been done, then you might actually dock and the thrusters aren't inhibited, and you can have a critical one, loss of vehicle. So over on the right, what we've done here is I've mapped the concept to incident response world. This is a generic procedure that we have at Leo for the initialization of the incident response team. Step 1 is for GC. It tells you, okay, who's going to be doing step 1? It's going to be the legal team, and he or she is going to, the first thing they're going to do when they call up the team is set the attorney-client privilege. Basically tell everybody, hey, you can say these things, don't say these things, talk to a lawyer, because remember, if it's an actual breach, there may be subsequent litigation afterwards, and you want to try to protect the privilege as much as possible. If you just jump in and start talking on the phone and you don't know who you're talking to and all these things, you've pierced that attorney-client privilege, and all that stuff that's been done during that period is discoverable by the other side. That could damage the company, cost them a lot of money. Step number 2, you see here, that's for the InfoSec group. And this is pretty basic stuff. You're going to ask you, hey, well, what happened in the incident? But So before the InfoSec group goes into the meeting, they can say, oh, look, these are the questions they're going to ask me. Let me maybe prepare something. And then over here, a couple other things I wanted to point out is you can have cross-references to different steps. So for example, if we want to preserve documentation, this tells GC, hey, go set the preservation and start doing document preservation. And then there's a rule here that you can reference. So if somebody says, I need to preserve information, director, I want to invoke this rule, and this is the reason why. We'll talk about rules in a second. Here's another reference to another procedure that says, listen, if anybody needs to engage third parties, maybe it's not good for the InfoSec group to engage the third party because then there's no attorney-client privilege. Maybe what we'll do is we'll have GC reach out to the outside counsel and have the outside counsel engage the forensics person, and then you'll have some attorney-client privilege there. So that just kind of reminds you to do that kind of stuff. Note that everything's got a step number. They get kind of complex, but at the end of the day, you can say, listen, we're in step 3.3, and everybody know in procedure 1.101, they know exactly where they are. It's easier to communicate that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's procedures in a nutshell. I could talk a lot more about this, but unfortunately we just don't have the time today. But this kind of gives you an idea of, instead of just everybody looking into a plan or just trying to remember what to do, maybe you pull it out, put it into a procedure, and then you can say, okay, yeah, it's very scary, by the way, when one of these events happen. You might freeze up, like a chicken, like the head cut off or hair on fire. You don't want that kind of stuff. This gives you something you can take a breath, look at your procedure and say, okay, I know what I'm doing, here we go. So the next thing I want to talk about that NASA did, which I think is very important and could be applicable to incident response plans, is the concept of flight rules. And flight rules are basically, thou shalts. Thou shalt do this at this time, or thou shalt not do this at this time. And what NASA did is said, okay, look, we're going to make these flight rules put the rule out there and then a little rationale. So here's some of the benefits that flight rules have. First of all, we pull them out of the plan and we give them to the disciplines. So each discipline will have a number of rules that it says that you can do this and you can do that, and in the event of this, we do this. So it sets out those do's and don'ts, right? It's also very easy to reference them, so you don't need to say, I'm on page 35 of the plan on the fourth paragraph, second line that tells me this, but rather, I'm in rule 1.2 or something of the sort. The other thing that NASA did says, okay, look, here's the rule, and here's the reason why the rule's in place, and you're going to see that in a second. So it provides that rationale. It's also very good for training, so if you want to certify somebody in the discipline, you say, okay, go read all of our flight rules, and go read all of the flight rules of all the other disciplines, and voila, you're certified. Another thing is that it inserts the subject matter experts. So there's a little reference under there that says, well, who came up with that rule? It was decided in this meeting by these executives on this date. So if you need to break it, maybe you talk to those executives or you talk to the governing body and say, listen, we're going to violate this flight rule. Is that okay? Yes, okay, because we know who to talk to. And then, of course, it's much easier to update. So let's take a look at a flight rule. This is an actual flight rule for the space shuttle. And the reason that I chose this one is because it's going to be applicable in the video that we're going to watch. Foreshadowing, we have what's called an alternating current bus loss during the launch that results in the booster discipline saying we need to take AC bus sensors off. So here you see during ascent, if there's any AC bus sensor failure, then you need to turn the AC bus sensors switches to off. And then it tells you the rationale, which is because we're down redundancy, and if there's any even hiccup, we don't want to switch over to a broken bus. So we turn those things to off, which prevents us from, maybe going off of our only remaining bus. So there's the rule, there's the rationale, and here you have the reference so that you can go look up, where that rule came from and who made that decision. Same thing applies to incident response. Here's the page 2 of an incident response directive that we provide for engaging law enforcement. And you can see here it says, no law enforcement communication will occur without outside counsel participation, because you want to set the privilege whenever possible. Here's one that says, no company hardware will be taken into custody by law enforcement until InfoSec gets to make an image of the device. We don't want the information going out and not having to ask law enforcement to have it back. And then, of course, here's one that says, prior to allowing them to monitor our systems, we need to have an agreement in place that whatever they find, they're going to share with us. So the rationale's down there, and the reference can be down there as well. And the benefit of that, of course, is while you're sitting in during an incident, well, do we need to do law enforcement? Let's pull out the law enforcement rule and see what the pluses and minuses are and see what would be required of us before we engage law enforcement. That way things don't get missed. So that's flight rules. Sorry to be ushering you guys through so fast, but we're about 10:36. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is really cool stuff, is how they do internal communication. When I'm talking about communication here, I'm talking about internal communication. And that was the problem, is because they had so many different disciplines that are working on one vehicle, they couldn't communicate with each other. Some of you guys may have been on a phone call on a bridge during an incident where you have too many people, maybe 40 people on an incident response call. You don't know who's talking. You don't know who they're talking to. You can't tell which one is talking, and they're talking over each other. The information is disseminated way too slowly, and people will be tautological. They say their point, and they say it over and over and over again. Well, NASA had that same problem back in the day, and so that's why they developed this internal communication protocol to make people be more concise, and so you understand who's talking. If Bob's not there, we're not talking to Bob, we're talking to Bob's discipline. So we just call people by their discipline. The other thing that NASA did is said, look, maybe we don't need every single discipline member in the room together, because that would be just too much. So what they said is, look, let's create the concept of back rooms. We'll have somebody who sits in the front room, that's why they call it the front control room. Those are the people that are talking to the flight director. And then we'll have an army of people behind him or her that are then helping him or her with certain specifics. So here's kind of how I mapped that onto incident response. For example, maybe you don't want all of these people in the same room or on the same call together. We certainly can let them listen in, but maybe we don't want them all talking. So maybe you have a communications officer that can then reach back and talk to the PR person, or talk to the call center or social media, or even talk to their outside PR firm. Same thing with InfoSec, talk to all these different people and then report back to the director or to the main team. So that's kind of the core team concept. And so here is what they came up with. They came up with the mission control environment and a certain set of NASA communication protocols. Over on the right, we have what's called the DVIS, the Digitized Voice Integrated System, made by Ford Motor Company. This one's actually obsolete now, and sorry for the low graphics, but this is the only picture I could find of that old system. This is what I came up on. And what this is basically showing you is everyone that has these little yellow things is something that the discipline is listening to. This happens to be the Capcom. I can tell that because it's got the Capcom thing, and he's got the ability to talk on space to ground. So he or she is listening to about 12 conversations at once. Think about that for a second. There's 12 conversations going on in your ear, and you need to parse out what's going to happen. You're going to get to experience a little bit of this during the video. You're going to hear, I think we got 3 channels that we're going to listen to in the video. These guys are listening to 12. So how do you do that? Well, the benefit of that, of course, is you're able to disseminate and absorb a whole bunch of information very quickly. The reason I bring this up for incident response is some of you may have been in a call where you're like, oh, I need to go talk to so-and-so, and they get off the call and they miss a bunch of stuff. They've lost their awareness. So it might be beneficial to have multiple bridges up to where they can listen to 2 bridges, they can talk to their back rooms and not miss the original call. It's possible, and it might make sense in certain scenarios. So how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing is the process. In NASA, what they say is, well, who are you calling? And then who you are. That's how you state it. So maybe if Booster's calling Fido, Booster will say, Fido Booster. And then since there's so many different communication channels, he or she might need to say what channel he's on. So it'll be like Fido Booster on Mokerdyne. And you might hear that in the video. That tells Fido, hey, listen, somebody's calling me. It's Booster, and I need to call up the Mokerdyne channel so that I can talk to that person. The other thing that they learned and beat into us was the concept of the relay. And again, it's all about making sure that everybody has good situational awareness. Situational awareness is extremely important in NASA. I think it also is very important in incident response. I think that a lot of people at Equifax lost situational awareness, and that's what caused certain issues that came to light. So what they do is they have this little relay, and you'll see me during the video, I'll be doing like this figure 8 thing, dancing around. That's because what they do is they'll say, the back room will say something, and the status, the front room. The front room will relay that to the flight director. The flight director will relay to the Capcom. Capcom sends it up to the crew. Crew will acknowledge receipt, do the action, tell everybody that the action's done, and then you'll hear it all over again where the back room says, and I copy that this was complete. That way they make sure that everybody understands what just happened. So you hear a lot of copies. It sounds kind of overwhelming at first, but I think that it's important because they keep everybody in situational awareness. And the last thing is the hierarchy of importance. And you know, I used to teach the communication course in NASA's Mission Operations Directorate. The biggest problem that we had there was what I call once upon a time theory, or once upon a time doctrine, where the newbies would come in and they would say, well, let's tell the story. I was looking at my data, they haven't said anything, saw this, then I talked to so-and-so, and then I looked at this, and then I looked at this flight rule, and then I came to the conclusion of this, and I want you to do this. Well, that was a way long way of saying I need you to do this. So what NASA does is say, let's flip it around. State the action. That's the most important thing. If you happen to have time, you can state what the failure is, but the action is the most important thing. We need to safe the vehicle. Then if you have time, you can state your reason, and then if there's time, you can state your analysis and hey, you came to that conclusion. So you'll hear a little bit of that on the video, where they basically say, I need AC bus sensors off. They may say what they saw. This was an AC bus failure. I need AC bus sensors off. And that's it. You've actually conveyed the information very quickly and concisely. Okay, so that was quick. I'm sorry that it was so fast, but that was basically the concept of the areas that we can map. We learned about procedures, rules, and communication protocols that they apply at NASA that might be applicable to incident response. Over on the right, I said there's a whole bunch of other stuff. I'd love to talk to you about that. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. We can get on the phone. I'll tell you all sorts of interesting, crazy stories of things that happened to me. But in the meantime, we need to get to the video. I just want to set the scene a little bit. We're going to watch a video about the Columbia. This is not when we lost Columbia. This is a launch to space back in STS-93. This was in 1999. I was in mission control at the time. I was working shuttle flights, but I was on every even flight, so I didn't work this particular flight. Eileen Collins was the commander, the first commander, female commander. It was the heaviest payload. We were launching the Chandra Space Telescope, and we had a great team on mission control. I call them the Top Gun. As I said, 7-year certification to be Ascent and Entry certified, and they really only need to be there for 8 minutes. It takes about 8 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, 20 seconds to go from the ground to space. That was true of Gemini, that was true of Apollo, true of the space shuttle, and it will be true of whatever they come up with next, Ryan. Here's our cast of characters. I call it a flurry of flight directors when there's more than 5. And here we have a flurry, there's 5. John Shannon is the flight director, but these are all other flight directors doing other roles. Important to note that the flight director has the ability to kick anybody out of the room. I think that's important. If somebody's causing issues, he can kick his boss's boss, the head of NASA directorate, out of the room, no problem. John Redding is booster. He's a steely-eyed missile man, as they call him. He's going to be getting the ride of his life here, as a lot of things go wrong. And his 2 back rooms that you're going to hear, the main propulsion system and the main engine. And the other person here I want to point out is Scooter. He's the capsule communicator. I mean, when I say Top Gun, these are the Top Guns. It wasn't Maverick or Iceman flying the F-14s in the movie Top Gun. It was actually Scooter. He did all the F-14 work in the movie. And over on the right here, we have kind of the names of the different disciplines. Real quick, just want to point out, these are the failures that they had on the vehicle on the way up. I don't have time to mention every single one of them, but it was an unbelievable amount of failures. In fact, because there were multiple failures, they made it to orbit. If there were only one set of failures here on the left, we wouldn't have made it to orbit. Or if we had it over here, we wouldn't have made it to orbit. So it was basically because we had both sets of failures, they canceled each other out a little bit. And you can talk to me afterwards, and I'll tell you how that happened. But the things that I want to point out is that they loaded liquid oxygen. They were running out. They had too little liquid oxygen by about 900 pounds. They were short because of temperature and fill sensor problems. And then once they fired up the space shuttle main engines, one of these LOX post pins shoots through the converging nozzle. That's the nozzle at the back. And those things have liquid hydrogen running through them to keep them cool. They get so hot. So you punch a hole through there, well, then hydrogen starts leaking into the nozzle. That's bad. Fortunately, if you break 5, you have a loss of vehicle case. We only broke 3, so we just barely made it. And then, of course, right after the launch, we see this AC bus short. That's because somebody over-torqued a screw. There's a little burr on it. Then maybe somebody stepped on a wire, and that shorted out the entire thing. Just a burr on a screw. I mean, that's how something that sounds so small can really change your day. So the result of the hydrogen leak is that, of course, you don't get as much cooling to the nozzle. It messes up your mixture ratio between oxidizer and fuel. You get thrust issues, so you're going to hear Fido asking for what's called, thrust updates, because he's trying to figure out, well, why aren't we where we're supposed to be? It's not working out. The chamber pressure goes down, and the shuttle does something very interesting. Instead of dumping more hydrogen into it, it dumps more liquid oxygen into it to try to get the chamber pressure up. Now, remember, we're already short on liquid oxygen. So by dumping more in, we're going to be burning more. Now, we should have been 3,000 pounds short. But fortunately, because of the AC bus short, it had to throttle down the center engine, which saved us the liquid oxygen. So that's how we got lucky. And the other thing is that you'll hear the booster guys are trying to figure out what the problem is, but they can't because the leak is below the sensor. So they have to wait long enough to see if it's a turbine problem or if it's a pump problem. Then they can determine if it's a hydrogen leak or if it's an actual pump problem. So you'll see them kind of work that issue. So here's where we're going to be working. This is the blue Ficker. It's not there anymore, but it was there when the shuttle was flying. And here's my final sci-fi graphic. I doubt anybody will know this one. This is Moonraker. The reason I brought this one up is because the movie came out before the shuttle launched. And so here you can see, first the external tank is painted, and that actually was true for the first launch. But the solid rocket boosters appear to be up there in space, and we certainly don't do that. I mean, we get rid of those things 2 minutes in, and then importantly, there's no smoke. And if you know, the solid rocket boosters put out an unbelievable amount of smoke. All right, so now what I'm going to do, let's hope that this works. We're going to go over to the video, and I'm going to kind of talk over the video a little bit. I might pause it on occasion. It's a wild ride, don't get me wrong, and everything's going to come at you really fast. That's understandable, and that's expected. It might be a little stressful. I hope it is, because it's stressful for me. It should be stressful for you, and an incident response is stressful. So the more you're trained, the less the stress goes down. I mean, the more stress goes down. So it's kind of the concept I want to put. And remember, we're only listening to a maximum of 3 channels. They're listening to 12. So here we go. There's a little bit of, there's not quite, it takes a second before you should. The little beep you hear is the Quindar. That's communication with the vehicle itself. And this thing's going to teach you a little bit about who we're dealing with. Sorry about the bad, it's a 1999 video, so it's kind of low res. I apologize about that. There's where the flight director sits. Capsule communicator, that's Scooter sitting right over there. Booster sits behind. He's the one you're going to hear a lot. And then, of course, Fido, they're trying to figure out with the flight dynamics officer where everybody is. Inco, we need to worry about because I'm going to probably skip over the communication. We had a loss of comm on top of everything else.
Inside 31.
Okay, that's Eileen Collins you hear. So here we're showing the back rooms. They're talking to the booster. That's the back rooms. And then the booster then relays that information to the flight director who sends it to Capcom and then up to the vehicle. There's your relay. That's my little figure 8 thing. Okay, here we go, the Rofies. They're burning off excess hydrogen. And as soon as we clear the tower, 6.6 seconds, then they light the solid rocket boosters, up we go. And as soon as we clear the tower, we're going to lose the AC bus, and you're going to hear all of that stuff. So try to figure out what happens.
Copy liftoff.
They throttle up to 104%, and here's the failure. Everybody catch all that?
Booster lost controller density, lost center engine A.
Okay, booster's basically saying what we lost, and he's going to say what we need to do.
AC bus sensors off.
There's the action. Then there's the relay. We're telling it to go to the crew, AC bus sensors off, per the flight rule.
Tell them that transient on AC1. Bus looks healthy this time. Roger that.
And then it's complete, and it comes back down. We take the AC bus sensors off. They're going to go back and look. Now, it's important to know that the flight controllers here, their main job is not to work issues. That's their secondary job. Their main job is to basically follow the timeline and get the vehicle into orbit. So they can't just say, okay, we're not going to follow the timeline anymore, we're just going to work all of the failures. So what you'll see is they're working the failures in between sticking on the timeline. Now, how are they doing that? Well, one of the ways they're doing that is because they have procedures. They've got this timeline there that says, okay, at this time, I need to do this, and at this time, I need to do that. What are some of the things that they're doing? Well, first of all, the space shuttle has to change its modes during flight. Like when the solid rocket boosters come off, they change the mode. When they get high enough into lower atmosphere, change the mode. When they're far enough downrange, they got to decide, they got to change the mode, and then they got to decide, okay, well, what's our abort landing site? Is it Banjul? Is it Ben Guerir? Are we going to abort to orbit? Or are we going to come back to Kennedy? And you'll hear all of these statements saying, okay, you need to load into the computer this landing site, and then this landing site, and then we're abort to orbit. We're abort to orbit with 2 engines. We're abort to orbit with 1 engine. All that stuff needs to be relayed to the crew. Why? Because if we have a failure and we lose communications with them, they need to know where they need to fly after the loss of comm. So we don't have time to tell them at that time. So we have to follow all these things. The other thing that I'll mention, and you'll see it in here, is that the space shuttle is flying 8086s. So those folks that are kind of my age may remember once they got rid of their TRS-80 or their Commodore 64 and moved up to the big 8086, that's what's flying on the space shuttle. The memory is so small that they actually don't have enough memory to run the entire flight software. So they have to dump the memory on occasion while they're flying the vehicle and reload a whole new operating system in there. It's kind of crazy, but they do it. Okay, so here we go. We've just had all of our failures. We told them to do AC bus sensors off.
Controllers.
Let's see what happens next.
We lost the DCU.
We're going to throttle down to 67%, and we're going to rip the nose off. Too much
On the
atmosphere.
center and AC3 on the right. Start on
He doesn't miss his
367.
cues.
In the bucket.
Main engine concurs and copies of
Back
your call.
room is trying to keep situational awareness. What you said was
Watching
right.
for GPC
Yeah, we're
113.
critical AC2. And AC3 flying.
Copy,
And
critical.
AC3 has to call.
Houston, we are
Throttling up.
Okay,
AC2 on the center
we're
engine.
high enough to where we can go up to
AC3
104
on the
again.
Three at
percent.
104.
Run left 3 to 14.
DCU-A on the center and DCU-B
We're going to call
on
that
the
up
right.
to the crew.
There,
Go with throttle up.
Copy that.
And Columbia, Houston, you are go at throttle up.
We did get MTF on both
Now they have a
engines.
little bit of time to work the problem. What happened? Okay, this is MPS calling booster. That was a good call.
Yeah, right,
Eagle
hydraulic pressure Bravo, lighting on the right.
Have any idea what tripped on AC1?
It looks like ratty data.
Check the storm in there.
Okay, did you guys catch all that? That was only 2 conversations going on at once. Remember, they got 12 in there. So on the left, the flight director's talking to the power system guy saying, hey, well, what happened? We lost the AC bus. You know, what are the repercussions there? On the right, you got main propulsion systems is talking to booster, trying to figure out, you know, whether this was whether it's a hydrogen leak or whether it's a pump failure, and he doesn't know at that point.
Fuel cell PA. The AC bus?
That's just when the, yes sir, when it bounced. It just did a self-test.
Copy that.
Booster main engine.
Go.
Yeah, we see higher fuel and oxidizer temps on
So
the
he's
right
saying
engine.
something's wrong.
Doesn't
He's
look like
basically telling them it's a performance case, they're off tags, and that they're
Copy.
going to have to work the problem. They're going to wait for a little while. We're about to come up on SRB SEP. So
And
booster's got to work
train
that
on
problem, but he
AC1
can't
right
miss
now.
the
See
call
that
to
line? I mean,
flight
looks
that they've
good on
had
all
the
the inverters.
booster SEPs. You'll see he makes that call.
Yes sir, the top 3 buses look healthy at this time.
That should be set.
There's the SRB SEP call.
103
103 converged. They're changing the
Copy.
ops mode of the vehicle, dumping memory and loading new stuff right now already. Performance
Copy now.
nominal.
Columbia,
Is the
Houston,
performance nominal? Doesn't seem so to us, but that's an actual PQ word. If it's off nominal, then they're going to go into different flight rules and have to operate out a different procedure. So that's why they make that nominal performance call. This is a statement, not a question.
Yeah, they did get the AC bus sensors off.
So backroom's going to concur with that, but he's going to check it. He's not
concur.
just going to say, yeah, copy.
Primary data on the
He's
center
going to go in
was
and
bad.
verify, yes, bus sensors are
Yeah,
off.
it is DCA
Situational
bus
awareness.
primary data. Just can't get the BSE channel here.
So here's the back room trying to work the problem and see what's going on. He's looking at the turbine speeds, he's looking at the pump speeds, he's waiting for one of them to
Trying to
give a cue.
recycle the BSE channel here.
Copy that.
Meanwhile, they're all looking at their timeline saying, okay, what's next?
Okay,
We're going to need to start making abort cues.
Two engines
So here we
down.
go,
Houston,
transatlantic
2 engine
landing,
bed.
2 engines. That's
No
where you're
space for
basically going to go
engine.
all the way across the landing. We're going to go to Ben Guerir.
update.
Interesting little fun fact, by the way. We've got a lot of different landing sites that we can use for the space shuttle. A lot of them are by oceans, which is good, but some of them are on dry land. A study was done. We found out that if we had to land a shuttle on dry land, it would be more expensive to go get it than to just leave it there. So whoever, got the landing would get a great museum.
Okay, we've got no suspects.
Copy, none. I got it. And main engine concurs, then booster.
Copy.
All the parameters on the right engine.
Okay,
Looks
he just
like,
figured it out.
possible
So
pre-buffering
basically he
algorithm.
says,
fuel
this
temps
is
and
what I
HVAC
see,
temps
and
and
now I'm
fuel
going to
is
tell you
open.
why I
The
think
fuel
that's the
discharge
case.
pressure is
State
low.
the failure first,
we're not meeting
and
all
then
cues.
the rationale afterwards, because you never know when something
We're
else
not
is going to
meeting
happen
the
and
HVAC.
Booster won't be
Yeah,
able to
we're
listen
not
to it.
temps.
We're
And
only
they'll kill
halfway
you.
towards the turbine temp on the H-pot to that.
I concur.
Okay, we're not going back to Kennedy now. We're too far downrange.
Copy, negative return.
You are negative
There
return.
goes our little, all the way up and all the way back down.
And the OPOV hasn't moved near enough for that.
Flight Fido.
I concur.
Fido flight.
We took a thrust update.
Okay,
at
so now
Flight
Fido
six.
says,
Flight
hey,
six,
we're
copy
not
that.
where we're supposed to
Booster out
be.
your
We're
engine.
close, but I'm
Engine's
concerned.
looking
So
good,
he's going to
flight.
ask
The
Booster.
right engine looks like the
And
tags
Flight
are off
immediately
on the
says,
right.
what's going on with Booster?
Doesn't
And what he
line up
sees
with
is like off nominal tags. That's a
Copy.
cue word
You
as
lose
well.
most
It
of your
says
data
that
on the center.
the engines are
Yeah, center
performing
engine
where
lost
we need them
primary
to be,
data due to
but there's
DC
something
right
wrong.
channel power fail. Okay.
That's the
Copy
flash
that.
evaporator system. That's how they
Copy,
cool the
good
vehicle up in space.
John, if the center went down, you'd expect it behind the data path. Is that correct? Negative.
How are we
flight.
doing
We
on
still
time?
have
3
secondary
minutes.
data. We still have the PC sensors.
We're going to have to
Status
jump
where
ahead
it's
here.
dead.
And main engine concurs.
So this is a great call. Booster main engine. Main engine
Booster
calls
main engine with
Booster and
sensitivity.
says what he's calling about. So Booster can
Go.
say, okay, well,
GPC
normally I
1.
wouldn't have time to talk to him, but
GPC
because he
2,
said with sensitivities, that's
and
important, I'm going to
also
respond.
GPC 3. I'll
Copy
give us
that.
command path.
Every word they choose
Command
is
data.
for a
Command data.
reason.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay, so we're going to jump ahead here and start talking about helium. In between where I jump ahead, they have a comm loss. They do a bunch of good calls. They have a
Okay,
couple
so
of
looking
bad
good
calls
helium,
from
good
some
LH
people,
on
but we don't have time to
That's
point that
ATO.
out. So let's see here.
104.
Okay, so now they're changing modes.
John, coming up
And
on
we're
a
going to start
minute
talking about
Miko
me.
here.
This
Any,
is a great
shutdown
call by
report?
Flight.
No
What
negative
Flight is
rounds
doing saying,
required. We'll
everybody,
watch
I need
Marlin
everybody to look at the
with
big
the,
picture.
secondary
We're coming up on
data.
Miko. We only have about a
Call.
minute. Is there anything you need to tell the crew before we lose burning? The answer is
Columbia
no, we don't.
Houston,
But
approaching
that's good that
Miko.
he's
Nominal
thinking
shutdown
about the
plan,
big
no
picture,
action
whereas
required.
everybody else has got their head down.
Handing over Cheaters.
That's why you need a flight director.
Check it up.
So there's we had our communication
3D
problems.
throttles.
Throttles on
Stand by.
3. Should have gone up UHF flight. Copy.
Concur 3D throttles on 3. With commands, no shutdown required.
Copy that.
Okay, so Miko is
5
main
minutes to
engine
3D throttle
cutoff.
on 3. Copy that.
About 15 to 20 seconds from now, what's actually going to happen is we're going to run out of propellant.
23K.
It's kind of like when you're landing on a plane and you run out of fuel right as you
Go
touch
for
down.
guided
It's a
Miko.
pretty scary thing.
Main engines go.
So it's a big, big deal to run out of prop when you're firing the vehicle.
Fuel advised.
So that's the question. Wait,
Fine.
how are we in this situation? Meanwhile, they're dealing with the comm loss. They can't even talk to the vehicle.
And Flight GC, we're not copying downlink on UHF to Bermuda.
Copy.
Okay, so
Arm,
that's the
arm.
they arm it for main engine cutoff because turning off those
Fine count.
engines, you can't
Fine
start them
count.
again. You need to make sure you do it at the right time. So here you'll see main engine cutoff,
Miko
and then they'll see the
confirmed.
low LOX
Miko
level cut.
confirmed.
Copy.
That wasn't supposed to happen. Flight doesn't have time to worry about that right now. He needs to keep moving on. We've got things to do. We've got ohms 1 burn we need to worry about, and we've got ET, the external tank needs to be punched off.
Go.
15 foot per second underspeed. Ohms 1 is not required.
Okay, so we don't need to do the
Keep that.
So here you're going to hear the
Looks like
flight
there was a
director
lock full of a cutoff.
Copy.
mention that we ran out of prop. So let's read this up to the crew. We got things we got to do.
Second underspeed, ohms 1, not required.
The last thing I want to show you is the flight director pulling everybody into a procedure.
And it's great to be back in 0G again.
And main engine is expecting dump on 3.
Okay, folks, all the post-ohms
So there he
one
is.
step.
He's saying everybody get into the post-ohms 1 step. Instead of having to say, okay, well, here's what we're going to do next. This, and all he has to do is say, get this procedure out and go to page 3-2. And then we're moving. That's why the procedures are so
3-2.
powerful.
Mister, did you see the flash on the low-level sensor?
So now flight has time to
Yeah,
say,
we
did
saw
we run
the
out of
lock
prop?
full of
Yeah, we
sensors
ran
all
out of
over,
prop,
go
flight.
dry, right at Miko,
And you
with
get
the
to see
underspeed
Flight's
there, it
response.
looked like
He's
it
a
was
cool
probably the lock
customer.
full cutoff.
Yikes.
Thank you, Brad. Sure. We don't need any more of these.
Yeah, we don't need any more of those. Okay, so that's our presentation. I've got, just a couple of quick takeaways in my view. I think it's really important that our incident response plans keep matriculating to the next stage. Some of the ways that we can do that, I think, are to tailor the incident response plans that you get from whomever you get them from, to your organization. Make them work for you. Also, pull out procedures and give them to the disciplines because they actively direct the team. I call them executable documents. Take the plan and make it into an executable document where you can pick it up and start moving. And then, of course, rules really help clarify what's going on and when you need to do things. I also like to have a director. I think that's very important. I have a lot of ideas about how the director needs to be trained and what the director needs to do. But there's certainly many ways to do it, and I'm happy to talk to you about the way I think it should be done. I think that you should have defined core disciplines that are trained, that are certified, and then it would be helpful to practice some internal communication so that you don't get on a call and have everybody just talking over each other. So that's my presentation. I'm sorry I didn't have time to take questions today, but here's all my contact information. These slides I think will be available on the website. So find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter. There's my email address. There's a phone number. Just give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you. So thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Seth. Seth, actually, we do have
Wait,
we do have about 5 minutes left. The other session's running a little bit late.
Oh, okay.
So if you have any questions, I've got a mic here. Anyone? All
No
right.
questions? Everybody understands everything about the space shuttle. Okay, here we go.
So after the Challenger disaster, any learnings from NASA that you incorporated it into your process?
Yeah, sadly, there was a Challenger report that was commissioned by Congress, and it had a lot of lessons learned. Especially one of the lessons learned is listen to your engineers when they tell you that there's an issue. Don't keep driving forward. The sad thing, and I wasn't there for the Challenger, and I also wasn't there during the Columbia. I had taken a hiatus, but after the Columbia, they did another report, and we had to read all of these reports. And unfortunately, if you took the Challenger report and the Columbia report and put them over, they were basically carbon copies of each other. So basically that says, yeah, we had a lot of lessons learned, but we didn't necessarily learn all of our lessons. One of the most important things, sorry, I keep walking around, is to give your team members the ability to throw a timeout card and say, stop, I have concerns. That was the biggest takeaway.
Okay, another question here?
What are your thoughts on Kerbal Space Program?
On the which?
What are your thoughts on Kerbal Space Program and how you might implement these into additional modules into the game?
I'm sorry, are you saying current space program?
Kerbal Space Program.
Kerbal.
It's like a NASA flight sim.
NASA flight sim?
Yeah, it's this as a video game essentially.
So I haven't heard about the Kerbal Space Program. I mean, basically I was in the Manned Space Flight Center, so if it's not a manned space flight thing, I probably don't know about it. I'm sorry. You're talking about Kerberos? We'll talk afterwards.
Thanks for the presentation and your openness, by the way. The Columbia disaster was a heartbreaking thing to watch, and they had a lot of the flight data available. The flight communications were available, and they came to the point where they said the vehicle is lost, and then it was radio silence. What do you believe was going on in mission control at that point when that radio silence happened?
So there was actually a defined set of... Okay, sorry about that. The question was, what was going on when we lost communication with the vehicle? As I said, I wasn't at NASA at the time, but there are a defined set of flight rules for what happens when we have a loss of comm. And the flight director was running a procedure. Lock the doors, everybody's got to lock down their computers, no information in or out, because they need to preserve all of that data. So he was basically going through a checklist, a procedure that says, lock the doors, lock the computers, call these people, do these things. So it was a well-defined, predefined thing. I wasn't asset and entry certified, as I said, so I really just kind of know a little bit about what they were doing, but it was certainly well-defined in procedures. All right, so that sounds good. We're at 11:05. Thank you very much. Come talk to me afterwards if you have any additional questions. And